right, so what we got here, the slideshow's got mostly words up there, but I tried to make it pretty.
There you go.
Yeah, we got
Come on, Zach.
there he is. He was headed for the refrigerator. I think I may have messed him up there. How not to foul up a brake job. Now, a lot of the time, brake jobs can get so routine that you can wind up thinking that you're, this is just a push, pull, snap, click job and everything. And so we're going to cover some stuff right here that is in relation to that.
The caliper's stopped up. You might want to change it.
Yeah, like on that one that we worked on, all that kind of stuff. If you neglect to determine the customer's driving habits, I had a whole Bendix presentation here on, you need to know how the customer drives the car. And, if there's somebody that just does light driving, they typically, what we most of the time do is we put the same pads on everything. But if somebody's wearing out the pads that are on the car too quick, and they might need to upgrade the pads and all that. But if you're going to deliver the best possible brake service, you've got to obtain as much information as possible from the customer. You got to ask them questions about, do you pull trailers? Do you stop? Do you mind having your wheels dusted up or whatever? The ceramic pads are only about 5% ceramic anyway. They're not all that much ceramic in a ceramic pad, but that doesn't dust up the wheels. But specifics is what you're wanting to know too whenever you're talking to them about their problem. Like for instance, on this Grand Cherokee out here, we'll talk a little bit more about it whenever the cows come home. But Brian and I have been working with this one here, and what it's basically doing, she thought she had a problem with the brakes because when she was stopping, she was feeling vibration and stuff. And she says, even when I let off the brake, I'm still feeling vibration. So I'm thinking, well, I guess she's talking about a pulsation or something, but it turned out that it was a transmission problem. And we got a part coming for that that'll be here in just a minute that we're hoping. We saw a couple of different problems happening and we think it might be related. But find out from them as much as you can, if you have a chance to talk to the customer someplace they don't like you talking to them. But get the service advisor or the service writer, whoever it is, to find out what kind of driving they do. That can help determine what type of parts will maximize the brake's life and the vehicle's stopping power, right? Okay, so a customer that tows or drives aggressively may require upgraded pads or rotors. Some rotors, the ones with the holes in them, and they have the cuts and all. Some people, my buddy over there that's got that shop between here and Dothan, he upgrades everybody's brakes to those if they'll let him because it's really good. It makes them run cooler and all that. Okay, number two, if you do an improper or an incomplete inspection, you need to be looking at it really close. You start with a road test at high and low speeds, if you've got some sort of a braking concern. All the braking components on all four wheels have got to be visually evaluated for leaks and wear. You're going to pull the tires after you've driven it, see what you feel that they might not feel. Have you guys ever, I got tickled one time whenever my son Matt was working at that tire store about 12, 13 years ago over in Enterprise. He drove it and felt a brake pulsation, and he brought it back in the shop and he threw it up in the air and he popped the front wheels off and they machined the front rotors and put pads on it. And he went back and he told Mike, the guy that owned the shop, he says, I've driven that thing after I've machined the rotors and all, and he says it doesn't change a thing about the way that it feels. And Mike looked at the clock and he says, yeah, and that woman will be here in about 45 minutes, and here we are with our pants down around our ankles. So anyway, he says, let's pull it off and let's check the back ones. Okay? And so we pulled the back wheels off, and it turned out the rear rotors were where the pulsation was. And you're going to find out that if you've got rear rotors and front rotors, about 40% of the time the pulsation you're feeling is the rear rotors. So if you just think, I'm just going to throw this on here and do the front, we'll be done, the back ones can cause you some issues too. So you'll get to where you can feel it because the back ones don't feel the same as the front ones whenever they're pulsing. Usually you'll feel a shake in the steering wheel, but not always. But the fact is, it's got a slightly different frequency / feel to it on the back. And all that. But anyway, all four wheels have got to be visually evaluated. If you pull the rotors, the hat rotors off, and you see worn out park brakes, you need to sell some of those too. Make sure that you don't have an illuminated ABS light on the dash. Now this Grand Cherokee's got an ABS light illuminated, and that's a right rear wheel speed sensor, which that one is an actual, it's not one of those sensors that makes the analog, it's actually a digital sensor on that one. When I was working at the dealership, I drew a job on a brand spanking new Grand Cherokee that had a code for one of the rear wheel speed sensors, and whenever I put a sensor on it and fixed it, and we called the hotline guy, or the warranty authorization people called, and they said, how did you know that wheel speed sensor was bad? How did you test it? And I said, well, I pulled a sensor off of another new vehicle and put it on there, and the problem went away. And he says, oh, because he thought I had measured it with a meter, and you can't do that as far as measuring ohms, on those. Anyway, but looking at your system should be a profitable upsell if you do it right, because you're going to find stuff wrong. I'm not saying sell stuff they don't need, but use a checklist if you need to help ensure components aren't accidentally overlooked. And make sure that you don't lose your hardware. You know what I mean? You're rushing and hurrying, and you're under the gun, and you bobble the ball, and maybe you set your brake parts up here just on the lift where they were sort of in a precarious position, and all of a sudden one of them has fell off and bounced away somewhere. Perfect example. Also, if you twist something off, such as happened not with brakes but with something else this morning, sometimes it's not easy to just get another one. If you got it in the back of your mind, I'll just have the person in charge get another one of these parts. Well, I had somebody twist off a caliper bolt, the banjo bolt that's hollow that goes on there. On one of the brake jobs we were doing out here, they went to tighten that thing up, like they figured, well, this is a 3/8 bolt with a fine thread. It needs to be good and tight, and so they hunkered down on it and they popped that sucker off. All right, so well, that's okay, but when I called the parts store and I said, I need a caliper bolt for this particular car, which is 3/8 SAE fine thread, and and this particular, they couldn't come up with one for several days. Right? This is the one I'm talking about. It's grade 8. It's drilled in the middle. It's a banjo bolt for that particular car. They sent a package with 2. We only needed 1 because they popped one of them off. It took 2 or 3 days to get that. Can you let the car go without one of these? No, that's a car killer, man. You leave it parked here, jacked up, while the customer's stomping their feet saying, what am I going to drive for the next 3 days because you were a bonehead and broke this off, and there ain't no parts house in this part of the country that has one like this. Be careful, because you could down the car and cause them some issues. Sometimes if you're working at a dealership, they may even rent a car for the customer to drive, especially if it's one that's fairly new, or if it's a really good customer. So be careful not to break anything off like that, because it's not funny to your service manager. But the bottom line is to remember there's more to a brake inspection than looking at the amount of retaining or remaining brake lining. You're not just looking to see how thin the pads are. You want to see if they're worn crooked, if anything else is froze up, or all that. Love those that come from up north, with all the rust all over them. Because occasionally you'll wind up having to replace the whole cage if you got one that the caliper bolt won't come out of. All right, next one, if you fail to inspect related systems. What's related systems? What else could cause something that might feel like something wrong with the brakes? Anybody can throw me? Yeah, good deal, good deal. But what else? Anything else? Steering and suspension, wheel bearings. You ever drove one that the wheel bearing was wore out on to the point that the rotor was moving around like this? You'd hit the brake one time and it would feel okay, and then the thing would flop around and it would push the caliper piston up in there, and the next time you hit it, the pedal would go almost to the floor because you had bearing issues or something like that. Make sure you look at that really close. Something else that'll happen is if you've got bad bearings, sometimes it can cause the ABS sensor to go bad because of that vibration and all. But anyway, worn steering and suspension components can have an effect on the braking ability. A vehicle that pulls one direction while braking may not have a brake problem, but a worn or bent control arm, ball joint, bushing. Because if you got things that are moving around whenever you hit the brake, if you got something that's moving, it can move. What's going to happen if you've got like these radius arms? that the bushings are wore out on, and I mash the brake and that tire moves back, what have I changed? What have I changed? I've changed caster, and I've also changed the setback on that side so it can make it pull. All right. Now then, if you pay attention to everything that's going on under there, I was telling Brian this morning, no, it was Cage when he was first looking at Cherokee, grab the wheels and pull them this way and that when you got it up and looking at the brakes to make sure that nothing's going on there. I'm not going to beat a dead horse on that, but you get the point. Incorrect parts replacement procedures, putting them on there the wrong way. Got that? Slapping pads and shoes on the vehicle and sending it out the door is not the proper way to service brakes. Okay, who in here can remember a few days ago when we did some brakes on one and it came back with a noise? Okay, what was the cause of the noise? The little anti-rattles was allowing the pads to go click, 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 move around. You could actually put the pad in place and move it and hear it clicking, which was the same noise they were hearing. Because when you machine the rotor, particularly if you do it faster, it's kind of cutting threads in the rotor. And it's going to try to move those pads back and forth. And so some of the pads come with new, how many of you guys have ever been putting brakes on and you see all of these shiny new anti-rattle parts and you say, well, I'm not fooling with those, I'll just put the old ones back on there, and you throw the new ones away and leave the old ones? You ever do that? Anybody ever do that?
Yeah.
See, I mean, that's the honest man right there. If you're sitting here saying, well, these are got some sort of funky shape, I don't want to have to figure out how to put them back on there. I'm just going to use the old ones because they're okay. Make sure that they fit nice and snug. On some of the old GM brakes, we used to take a hammer and tap those little ears in on the brake so that they would, the pads would go on there really tight so that they wouldn't click around when they were trying to stop. All right. So, all right. You'll bump that air conditioner down a little bit so it'll dehumidify the room a bit. Now, if you're going to have a binding or struck brake component, you know, like those little, always make sure the calipers can float. Always make sure that you clean and lubricate everything as good as you can. I actually have a YouTube video about that. And so here we go. When you're putting the brake rotors on, whether they're new or newly machined, use a dial indicator to measure for run out. That's not a bad idea to do that. If you catch run out problems before the car leaves the shop, it saves you from pulsation comebacks. Well, if you machine the rotors with the own car lathe we got so that it is being machined where it lives, you won't have trouble with that. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a pop test on all this tomorrow, so you better be remembering what I say. All right, so and I'm gonna wait till after the pop test before I post this on YouTube too, by the way. Or should I? Should I put it on YouTube before I do the pop test or after?
Yes.
Yeah, there'll be a 10-question pop test to make sure that you guys were paying attention. All right. Now, the next thing would be use of poor quality parts. What do you think about that? Oh, well, let me see, back up. Yeah, there we go. Okay, I left one out, so you'll just have to put up with that. Partial replacement of parts that you need. Partial replacement. If a vehicle brake system is designed so that all the components in the system work together, and you only put part of the stuff on there that it needs, one of the most egregious examples of that is when the customer doesn't want you to put everything on there that it needs. Now, there is a line there between safety and, you know, just doing things, you know, in a fastidious way. But brake service procedures based on cost and not performance or longevity can lead to problems. You want to be careful about that. A high mileage vehicle that comes in with a sticking caliper and a cracked flex hose on one side only, if they say, well, I don't want the flex hose and I don't want the caliper, just throw me some pads on there, well, they're going to be coming back to you if it doesn't stop exactly right. So it might not be a bad idea to go to put them on both sides. I do remember this funny article that Larry Carley wrote about 35 years ago that I was reading. And he said that this woman had taken her car to the shop and they put calipers on it. And she started having trouble with the brakes again about less than a month later. She took it back and they wanted her to buy calipers again. And so she was confused about that. She says, because he worked there in the office, and she says, can you ask about this? It's kind of funny how he said it. He said he calls the guy and he says, you just put calipers on this thing about 3 weeks ago, and now she needs calipers again. Now, why are you wanting her to cough up more money for new calipers when you just put them on 3 weeks ago? And the guy says, well, that's why we sell replacement calipers. You never know when one's going to go out. And then he followed up by saying, this guy wasn't a rip-off artist, he was a yo-yo. I mean, anybody that comes back with an answer like that, you know. All right, so you don't want to change the components on both sides, you know. Ever buy a hardware kit so that all the components come, you want to put them all on there. In other words, like on brake shoes in the back, if you buy a spring kit and it's got the ones for both sides, put all of them on there. Don't just put the ones on there on the one side. What if you don't replace the wheel cylinders in the rear and you find out when you pull the boots back that they're leaking? What if the drums are just a little bit below, you know, too big for spec, or the the discs are a little bit too thin? Now, my lunch partner back before I came here, I hadn't been working here very long, and he was driving his car, and he had been having the brakes done somewhere. I don't know, he wasn't having it done here. And whenever he went to mash the brake one day, the brake pad just shot out of there. It had worn down thin enough to where it could get out from between the rotor and the caliper. And you know why it was able to do that? Was because the place that was doing his brakes kept machining the rotors without checking the thickness until they got them thin enough so that when the pad worn down enough, he hit the brakes one time, he had good brakes. The next time the pad shot out and he had nothing. And he almost drove up under a truck that was going past a yield lane. So be particularly careful about that. Now, here we go. He goes, poor quality parts, right? You know, brake service is competitive. People are going to go where the money is cheapest. We all want to be get the sale and be profitable. You know, there's a lot of sources for obtaining dirt cheap parts. Let me see what he's saying about these tires. All right, tell me about my tires. Outstanding performance. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to talk to her about that, especially since you can't get them today anyway. So let me back up and punt. All right. Boy, that's aggravating. But anyway, here we've got, if you got a bargain price rotor or a set of pads, now we buy the ones that are on special from Advance, but they're not bad. But you know, if you're buying really, really cheap Chinese stuff, you may have issues. Now, if a supplier is pushing a line of brake parts that's price too good to be true, ask for a sample set for your vehicle or the technician to try out, you know. In other words, I'll say, let me try some on my car and see how they work. Better for us to be the guinea pig than the customer. Now, here we go. Let's go here. Poorly maintained brake service equipment. If you've got rotor turning machines or anything else you're using that's supposed to be doing a good job and it's not working quite right, or maybe it's not machining properly, or maybe the remember, you know, somebody was, who was that? Jonathan, I think you were over there. The cutting bit on that one over there, the screw had come loose and it broke the screw off, and when you're trying to cut it like that, if the little bit's dancing around, it'll make little flutes in there and all that kind of stuff. You got to make sure all those screws are tight and everything. And sometimes we just throw the rotors on there and let it go. Do you know what the spec is? Do you know what a spec is for that shaft coming out of the rotor lathe on the other side of that M-code? If you put a dial indicator on it and you got it against there and you turn that thing on, you know how much radial run out of that shaft? I mean, that shaft is 1/1000th of an inch is what they'll allow, and I don't even like that. Water-based brake washers have got to be cleaned to prevent lining contamination. If they get too greasy and everything, you may have issues on that. Also, always remember when you're pulling drum brakes off to make sure you use something wet to get that dust off of there so it can't fly, because you don't want to be breathing it. Don't use the blower. All right. Now, a lack of preventative maintenance. Regular brake inspections are important. Every time you change the oil on a car, is everybody listening? We do a lot of oil changes in here. Every time you change the oil on a car, you need to be getting your light out and you need to be looking at the brakes just to see what you see. You got me? I mean, and that's if you're working at a shop too. If you're working at a shop and you do brake inspections and you notice that tire alignment is not right and you notice you got loose front end parts, let's say they throw you an oil change and you get over here and you legitimately find worn out front end parts, worn out brake pads, and tires that are wearing wrong, because it needs an alignment. And you go back to the guy that's writing the tickets and talking to the customer and saying, you really need to have your alignment checked. I'll see how these tires are wearing out. And let me show you on the car how you've got this loose ball joint that could come apart, or the tie rod end or whatever. And have you ever seen a ball joint come apart? What happens?
Tire falls off.
No.
Like it falls back on.
Yeah. Well, the bumper will hit the ground sometime, boom, like a ton of bricks. And they can be cracked part way through. But the simple fact is, if you find worn out parts and you go to your boss man and say, this thing needs more work than just an oil change, and they go to the customer and they say, you need all of this work, and they won't let you do the work. See, if you hadn't put a wrench on it, you're not liable for it. Well, hey, we told her about it. She wouldn't let us do anything. The brake fluid flush is something that needs to be done, like I said before, with brake fluid, because the ABS stuff. Now, I'm going to go through a talk here probably next week on to flush or not to flush, because there are different schools of thought on that. But if the fluid's got water in it, or if it's basically you use your little fast car dip strips and you find out that it's all contaminated, the smart thing to do is, put a bottle on every wheel and just keep pouring clean fluid in it until you've pumped it all through to where nothing's coming out but clear fluid. It's a good way to do it, because you don't have to bleed the brakes if you do that typically. You just push in new fluid through there. And it's a good idea to have good clean fluid in there. It's really pretty critical, though, to keep good clean fluid in there. A lot of the times we don't think a lot about that. Finally, here, failure to apply your training. If you don't understand basic brake fundamentals, you can't be an effective service provider. How many of you guys have done your brake training or completed the brake training on your electude? Huh? Yeah. What's the hold up on it? What you waiting on? Sundown or payday? You know what I mean? Did you know what I was doing this weekend? I was doing training. I could have been doing anything else I wanted to do, but I was on my computer at home and I was doing training, because I got to have a certain amount of professional development training every year. I mean, maybe I'd have rather been playing Battlefield 4, but basically I went in there and did my training. And I sat there and I went through that training. So it's not going to hurt you to punch. If you chip away at this training, by the time the end of the semester gets here, you won't be saying, oh no, I'm failing my classroom because I didn't do my electude stuff and now I don't have time. It takes some time to do it. You know what I mean? So don't kick that can down the road, because it'll bite you. All right. So finally, how many of you guys have found out later that you should have looked up service information and chose not to, and wound up getting in hot water because of it? Somebody can show you, I have people all the time that's coming to me saying, how much oil does this hold, or how much of coolant does that hold, or what's the torque specs on these? Basically, you just need to go and look it up and get used to looking it up, because it's a good idea. Technical service bulletins are good too. Sometimes you'll find technical service bulletins that'll fix a problem for you really quick. You can go to Identifix, and if you remember IETN, you can go there. But whenever you go there and it zooms you right to the problem, it's a very smooth thing when you go and you say, goodness gracious, how long am I going to have to work on it to find this? And then you go punch it in, and it's like having 1,000 mechanics raising their hands saying, like you say, got a room full of 1,000 mechanics, say, how many of you guys have seen this and this? And they'll say, yeah, I worked on one of those that did that, and this was the problem. If you'll look there, you'll probably see signature marks. You go say, goodness, that would have took me a long time to find if I hadn't got that information from that guy. That's what technical service bulletins and Identifix and all that stuff's about. Really important to do that. Now, there's no reason not to use the information we got. Computers are all over the place out here in the shop and in the classroom, and so make sure you avail yourself of that. Now, how many of you guys have worked on something that after you worked on it, it came back and wasn't right because of something you missed? Why do we only have 2 people raising their hands? Nobody else?
Probably.
The other ones of you must not have done much work, huh?
No.
What?
what they told us was.
Okay, so you raised your hand, he raised his hand, he raised his hand. That's an honesty thing, you know. Whenever they used to, at the Ford dealership, the shop foreman used to have to drive behind somebody that had, you know, was having comeback, and he was not easy to satisfy. And so I told him one day, I said, what you're doing is what's called quality control. And he kind of liked the sound of that. So he got a sticker made that said QC, and it had a signature line under it. And he gave it to the service writers, and when one came back in that we had worked on and the customer perceived that we didn't fix it right, they would stamp it with that red QC stamp. And whenever the mechanic would get one of those, it'd make him mad, because it wasn't always the mechanic's fault, you know. But you always had to go get the shop foreman to sign off on it. I mean, if you work in a big shop, that's just life in a big city, you know, you're going to put up with that. Well, one day one of the service writers made a mistake on a ticket that he wrote, and so I got a sticky note, and I put on it, and I stamped it with his QC thing, and I said, this is a quality control ticket for you, buddy, you didn't write it up right. And he took that sticky note, made him mad. Well, I say, now you know how it feels when we get one of those. We don't like them. Here's the point. If you don't like them, make sure you do a good enough job to where you don't get one, okay? Because one of the things they're wanting to know, the way they gauge your effectiveness in the shop is, does the work they work on come back to have to be redone? And if you happen not to be there and somebody else has to redo it, see what I'm saying? It even makes you look worse. But I mean, always be honest about that kind of thing. Everybody likes to dodge and say, not my fault and all that kind of thing. But if you were the only one that laid a wrench on it, you know, you're going to have to face the music. Yeah, you're going to have to do really good work if you're going to survive in this industry. And there's a lot of jobs out there. Anybody got any comments or anything? You going to weigh in on this? Did I put anybody to sleep? Okay. Well, make sure that you're ready for the pop test, because there's going to be one tomorrow. Okay? You ready? You going to remember this stuff? All right then. Huh?